and gentlemen, I suggest we start. My name is Slava Radosevic, and I am acting director of School of Slavonic and East European Studies. And I'm extremely pleased that I have this privilege to chair tonight's event, which is our now second EBRD CIS Transition Report launch. And we hope it will become a tradition, so we already booked ourselves for the next year. And we have a very nice lineup of speakers tonight. I suggest we give floor to Peter Sampey, who is one of the major, as always, co-authors and persons behind this report with long-standing experience in the EBRD, and we have a very nice cooperation with EBRD. Why? Because we are probably one of the few institutions that takes this report very, very seriously, namely we use it also as a part of our teaching. So I think there is a very close mutual interest to continue in this tradition. After that, I will invite Božidar Đelić, who is a former Minister of Finance in the first post-Milosevic government, very nice legacy. And I think it's very nice to invite ex-ministers, because then they are much wiser when they get out of the office. They don't have this political burden, and they are just enlightened policy makers. And then we will hear Julia Kirali, who is currently professor of economics, but also former deputy governor of the National Bank of Hungary and member of the Monetary Council. What an exciting country today, and a person that also has this wisdom now, and with a distance can tell us much about the issues that are embodied in this report. And I'm very pleased to have one of our I wouldn't say ex, he's currently CIS honorary fellow. He was our colleague until a few years ago, Professor Tomek Mickiewicz, and I'm extremely pleased to have him again here with us, and it's just a part of our ongoing cooperation and visible CIS network. So without further ado, I would like to invite Peter to give us the major points from this year EBRD Transition Report, which I must admit, I forgot two major points. I've read it, parts of it, as much as I could, and I think it's a quite important report, because I've read I've read all of them, believe me, every year. And I think in this lineup of transition report, I put it at a level with the 99 transition report, which summarized the 10 years of transition, where there's a lot of kind of political economy there, which has in-depth analytical analysis. A good analysis, and I think this is at that level, that sort of importance. So it doesn't happen every year. So I strongly recommend you to look at the report. And the second thing why I think that this report is quite important, it comes at a period, and the report says it very nicely, where we are at the beginning of a kind of third stage, as the report nicely put it. First is the stage of a one-off productivity improvement growth, which comes through transition of the 90s. Then we've got kind of spurting growth during the first decade, which was driven by low cost of capital and the whole financial globalization issues. Then comes 2008, the global crisis, and now we are in the stage where everything is open. And the report nicely summarizes it and poses this very big issues where the region is going now. And it is very much inspired by some of the academic writings. If you are not familiar with the book Why Nations Fail, Acemoglu and Robinson, I feel there's a spirit of that behind. And I'm sure we will enter immediately into starting maybe to criticize it. Finally, we have economists, two economists, three opinions, as they say. And if I was to criticize it, then I would say, if you want to criticize it, then you have to read the reviews of the critique of Acemoglu, and it's this idea of the political institutions and growth. But I'll leave that to our panelists, and I just think that these are useful kind of hints for you to motivate you to read this report and look at it seriously. Peter, please.
Slavo, thank you very much for that introduction, those kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be here on behalf of the Office of the Chief Economist at the EBRD to present to you one of the first presentations we're doing of our new transition report. Indeed, if you can call 2 years in a row a tradition, then this is a tradition that I'm very proud and honoured to be part of presenting it here with UCL as the hosts. Now, the transition report has built up a long history. It's actually the 20th transition report. The first one was in 1994, so some people like Slavo, maybe there are others here in the audience who are veteran readers of the report. If you are, you'll notice that it's a little bit different this year. In fact, the report is different in several ways, and one way that I enjoy the benefit walking over here with 8 or 9 of them in my bag is the report is actually a lot thinner this year, and there's a very good reason for that. Normally the report is divided into 2 parts. We have chapters of analysis, and then at the back we have country by country analysis of structural reforms, macroeconomic developments, key challenges ahead. This year the country pages have been put to the website only, and if you haven't yet looked at our website for the transition report, I do encourage you to, because we have put a lot of resources with the tech guys to build this up and to make it much more user-friendly than it used to be. And I think already we've received quite a bit of praise just for the technological improvements in this year's report. So that is one way the report is different. But I think more importantly, the report is really analysing in depth a theme that we haven't looked at before, and that's the interaction between politics and economics. So the report this year is potentially controversial, and furthermore potentially difficult. So I had an email on Sunday from a friend of mine in Belgrade, actually, and not Bojidar, it's a female friend. And she is an avid reader of the transition report, has the full set at home, and she emailed me and said, I've looked at the report, it's very interesting, but I think almost no one will understand it. And I was a little bit taken aback. We had a little exchange, and then she said, okay, it's a great report, but it did bring home to me that perhaps this report is maybe a little bit more sophisticated, perhaps, or a little bit more dense. Perhaps the arguments are a little bit more abstract than previous reports, where usually we're focusing on one particular sector or aspect of the economy. So my job tonight is, in the space of half an hour, is to try and convey the essence of this report, what it's about in, I hope, simplified but not simplistic terms, and then we'll hear from our panelists, who have all got advanced copies of the report, what they have made of it. And I really can't tell you how delighted I am to be on such a great panel, a distinguished panel, as the 3 guests we have here tonight. And then we'll open it up to questions and answers. Okay, so in a nutshell, this report, the title is stuck in transition. Now, we debated about the question mark, whether it should be there, and we left the question mark in because it is a question. Are we really stuck, and are some countries more stuck than others? The report it's undoubtedly true that the region is in difficulties. Whether it's stuck or not, one can argue, but certainly the past 4 or 5 years have been tough times for the transition region. I do look back a little bit nostalgically. I looked at some of my presentations that I made in Belgrade and elsewhere 7, 8 years ago, when we were very upbeat about Serbia and about the region and about how transition was evolving. And really, since the crisis hit in 2008 and 2009, it's been really a different story. So the report is primarily about 2 things. Why has the convergence that we saw between the early 1990s and the late 2000s, why has that process slowed? And there are basically 2 answers. One is that what we call the low-hanging fruit of transition, so the sort of early, easy gains, they have been, this fruit has been picked in most countries. So we've exhausted the kind of, in most cases, the easy gains of transition. And the other reason is that the reform process has either slowed down or it's just stopped, and in some cases it has even reversed, we would argue, since the middle of the last decade. So that has slowed down this convergence in living standards to the advanced Western countries. Now, the second thing the report is about what can we do to invigorate the reforms, to improve the institutions necessary for convergence to return. So it's as I mentioned earlier, the report is very much about the interaction between politics and economics and how democracy and market reforms and institutions can all reinforce each other, either in a positive or a negative sense. But it's also about getting around the political constraints to reform, and it involves therefore looking at things like human capital and economic inclusion, which are the subjects of the later chapters in the report. So with that very broad summary in mind, I'm going to talk you through the 5 chapters with the aid, of course, of visuals and charts and so on, and give you the main points. Okay, so convergence. So these we see as the 3 main reasons why it has slowed down. It's the, as I said, the end of the low-hanging fruit, the end of the productivity catch-up that we saw between the early 1990s and the late 2000s. It's the fact that reforms have stalled in many cases and have even been reversed in some of the more advanced transition countries. So let me just illustrate a few of these points. This chart I think is a very interesting one, and it's a very simple one. It's taking the growth rate between the early 1990s and 2010 for 4 broad emerging market regions. So Latin America, emerging Asia, CEMED. CEMED is our acronym for Southern and Eastern Mediterranean. It's the acronym we use for our new countries in Northern Africa and the Middle East. Many of you may be aware that the EBRD has expanded geographically into Northern Africa, Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia, and also into Jordan in the Middle East. So we refer to this region as CEMED. And then lastly, the traditional transition countries. And this is a simple growth accounting exercise using the Penn growth tables. You can decompose the growth into growth in labor, growth in physical capital, growth in human capital, and then productivity. Productivity is what's left when you've exhausted the other 3 explanations for growth. And you can see on the right-hand side, oh my goodness, you can't see very well, it's a bit, can you see the, so there should be a bar here, it's not very visible in this.
Yeah, up to your...
yeah, what is invisible?
Up to the dot, yeah.
To the dot, yeah.
This is the total factor productivity in the transition region, which dominates all the other explanations for growth. So growth over that period was really a story about productivity growth. And the thing is that the productivity is more or less caught up at this stage. And for that reason, we can't expect to see that as being the main driver of convergence unless there's really a concentration on other things like institutions and human capital. So I'll come back to that point later. Now, when it comes to reforms, again, devotees of the report over the years will know that we've been tracking and measuring reforms by country through a set of transition indicators. And we have this numerical scale we've used over the years, which goes from 1, meaning basically unreformed, to 4 plus or 4.33, which would be the standards of hypothetical advanced well-functioning market economy. Now, if you look at how reforms have evolved over the years since the beginning of transition, you can see that, and here we divide by region. So the acronym CEB is Central Europe and the Baltics, SEE is Southeastern Europe, EEC is Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, that's Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, and the Caucasus. Russia we treat by itself as a very large country, and then Central Asia. You can see that in all regions there was, in the 90s, a period of fairly rapid reforms. The easier reforms were being put in place, and then a leveling off. Now, of course, by design, these lines have to level off at some point. They can't go beyond 4.33, but the point is that even in the most advanced countries, they have leveled off now at a point where there's still some significant transition gaps. That is the case even in the most advanced countries. And you can see that, worryingly, they have leveled off in the likes of Central Asia at much lower levels. So, and this is particularly true since the middle of the last decade. So there's been really a stagnation of reforms in the past number of years. Now, another slightly worrying trend is that the attitudes of people have changed. So this chart is drawing on a major household survey that I have spoken about in previous presentations here, the Life and Transition Survey. It's a survey done jointly by the EBRD and the World Bank, first carried out in 2006 and then repeated in 2010. So one of the questions is asking people about whether they're in favor of a market economy under all circumstances, or under some circumstances do they think a planned economy is preferable. And what you can see here is that they cannot see. Okay, so I'll have to. Okay, so what has happened? If you could see on this, there's a in the new EU members, roughly 45% or so supported the market economy in 2006. That dropped to 35% in 2010, and it's a similar story, although not as stark a drop, in the Western Balkans. So in the Central and Southeastern Europe, there was a drop in support for the market economy between 2006 and 2010. So in other words, pre and post-crisis. And of course, this makes it more difficult for policy-oriented reformers to push through reforms if there isn't the public support for it. I do apologize about these charts I'm showing up. They're very clear here on my screen. So now let me see how this one looks. Okay. Let's use one color that doesn't come out very well. Now, this chart is based on another piece of analysis that we do now every year. These are sector-level transition indicators. So just as for many years we've been measuring reform at the broad country level and reforms like privatization and liberalization. Now, for the last few years, we've been analyzing at the sector level the state of transition and the challenges that still face countries. And again, we have a numerical score which allows you to track upgrades and downgrades each year. So what we're showing in this chart is the number of downgrades we've had in the past 3 years. And interestingly, the downgrades are concentrated in our EU countries, so the most advanced countries, and not in the non-EU members. And you can see particularly last year, and also again this year. Now these reflect things like, in the energy sector, for example, we've seen a number of countries roll back on tariff reform or on renewable energy reform. In the financial sector, we've seen attacks on pension systems and indeed a financial transactions tax in one particular country, Julia may reflect on later. And in the corporate sector, again, we have seen certain reversals, sometimes to do with privatization, sometimes even involving the taking back into the control of the state of a previously privatized entity, for example, US Steel and leaving the steel company in Serbia. So, so these are some of the downgrades we've seen in recent years, and again, they're concentrated in the EU members. Okay, now this one really is difficult to show on the screen. Okay, well, we'll see the next one. Now, so what we've done, but the question is then, what does all this mean for long-term growth? And of course, an honest answer to that would be we don't really know. We don't know, we have very little idea what growth is going to be next year. So we really can't say with much confidence at all what growth is going to be in 10 or 20 years' time. But nevertheless, heroically, we've tried an exercise of at least coming up with some simulations about what growth is likely to be over the next 2 decades. And this is based on a cross-country data set with 88 countries covering the last 30 years. It's a 4-equation model, quite a standard kind of neoclassical model, and with a broad range of countries encapsulating both transition and non-transition countries. Now, what we show, what you can see visibly here, and again I'll have to talk you through, are the estimated convergence with the EU 15. So if you take, let's take Bulgaria here. So by 2011, Bulgaria's GDP per capita is nearly 40% of the average in the EU 15. So this is, if you like, the pre-2004 EU members. Now, what we've done is some simulations on how that convergence might evolve in the next 20 years over under existing policies. And in fact, what turns out is there's not much convergence at all. So in 20 years' time, Bulgaria would still be less than half of the EU 15 average. If you take a country like Poland, it's now around 62% of the average. It would level off at around 65%. Hungary, a similar 62, 63% now, would level off maybe around 70%. And similarly for other countries. Now, what you can, sorry, the wrong way. What you can see here, and this actually nicely shows that these little green dots, this is the benefit you get if you allow institutions and economic policies to converge gradually over time to the best practice currently in the most advanced transition country. So it's a little simulation exercise which says, suppose institutions actually improve and reforms advance, not in one go because that's not realistic, but over time, what kind of growth dividend do you get and what kind of convergence do you get? And you see that actually it's quite substantial in some cases, particularly as you move further east to countries like Russia and Kazakhstan. But even in EU countries like Croatia, Poland, and Slovakia, it can still make a difference of 5 to 7 percentage points in the long-term GDP per capita relative to the EU 15. Okay, so this is our message about the importance of reforms. It can make a substantial difference in the long term according to this simulation exercise. Okay, now chapter 2, I should make a disclaimer about chapter 2. It's actually written by, not by the Office of the Chief Economist, although we did edit it and put our stamp of approval on, but it's written by our political councillors in the bank. And so they got together and wrote a very interesting chapter on the links between democracy, reforms, and institutions. And I'm just going to show a couple of charts from this. The first one, which shows that, not surprisingly, there's a correlation between the level of economic transition, which is on the vertical axis, and the level, as measured by us at the EBRD with our transition indicators, and the level of democracy as measured independently by the polity database that some of you may be familiar with. But which way does the correlation go? Well, there's some interesting regression analysis in this report. And one of the analyses shows that if you regress the level of democracy now, or in 2011, which is the latest data we had when we did the analysis, and regress it on a bunch of variables, including per capita income and including controlling for the initial level of democracy, but also regress it on the level of economic reform in the early years, again, you get quite a strong link between the two and quite a strong prediction. It's not quite a linear shape, it's more like a kind of S shape. But the level of reforms in the early years of transition are quite a strong predictor of the level of democracy today, even controlling for a range of other factors. So that I think is an encouraging message about how the two can go together. But that leads then to the question, what determines the level of economic institutions? Slavo mentioned the book by Acemoglu and Robinson, which is really, in a nutshell, is saying that it's institutions that matter. That countries fail if they have bad institutions and they succeed if they have good ones. So chapter 3 in the report looks at the determinants of economic institutions. Now, what do we mean by economic institutions? Well, again, to do analysis, you have to have some measures. So we've used a range of measures in this chapter. We have our EBRD transition indicators that I've spoken about. We also use the World Bank's global governance indicators, which look at things like rule of law, control of corruption, government effectiveness, and so on. And we've used the World Bank's Doing Business report as well, which is a very sort of factual analysis of business environment measures. And again, it can be used as some kind of proxy for economic institutions. Now, taking these variables and putting them into regression on the left-hand side and controlling for various things, you can come up with different explanations for the difference between the institutional quality of the best transition countries and the institutional quality of those at the bottom. So what you see here, oh God, you can't see a thing except the last one. I do apologize for this, it's the blue color that doesn't show up. So let me just talk you through this. These are, on the horizontal axis are some of the factors that might explain the difference in institutional quality in Estonia, say, and in Turkmenistan. So it could be things like geography or history, it could be membership of the EU, it could be just broader income levels. It could be natural resources. Now, natural resources, you've all heard the phrase up to the natural resource curse, that natural resource countries with large levels of natural resources are often less democratic and have lower quality institutions than those that don't. We can control the level of democracy, but what comes out most strongly is the bar on the right-hand side. You can see the trade openness, and on top of that also is financial openness. And these are the factors, actually, that explain, more than any other factor, the difference between the top performers and the bottom performers in terms of institutional quality. Now, chapter 3 also has I think, a quite interesting descriptive analysis of what we call windows of opportunity. And again, it is very much driven by, the thinking behind this was driven by the Acemoglu and Robinson book. So it's looking at critical junctures in history when you can go one way or the other. Now, there's a case study of 4 countries where there was a clear democratic change, and that was reflected in this polity scale on democracy. So we had Georgia in 2003, the Rose Revolution, Romania in 1995 or 95-96, the Slovak Republic in 98, and Ukraine's Orange Revolution in 2004. So these 4 events, I think, created opportunities. And what we argue in the report is that in 2 cases, so the case of Georgia and the Slovak Republic, the opportunities were, to some extent, taken by reformers on the ground, whereas the opportunities were missed, arguably, and countries were set back for some years in Romania and Ukraine. And, okay, good, this is visible. So what you see here, let's take the bottom 2 lines, the solid and the dashed line. This is Georgia. So at time t, that's, in the case of Georgia, that was 2004, was the election. And there was a jump in the polity index. And you can see how although that level wasn't actually maintained over time, it did drop a few years later, the level of economic institutions rose and stayed significantly higher than they were initially. Similarly, in the Slovak Republic, so in 98, the Slovak Republic was actually in the slow lane towards EU accession. The matriarch government and so on had held it back. He was replaced in 98, and again, a jump in the democracy index to a very high level, and economic institutions gradually increasing. Contrast this with Ukraine and Romania. So Ukraine are the bottom lines, where there was an opportunity with the Orange Revolution, but the opportunity wasn't really taken by reformers. In fact, the quality of institutions has declined gradually since then. Romania in 95, 96, again, elections, a chance to break with the past, with the regime that had taken over after Ceausescu failed. The level of democracy was maintained, but again, it took quite some time before the level of economic institutions took off. And that's one of the reasons why Romania, along with Bulgaria, was held back from that first wave of accession in 2004. Now, there are different reasons why some countries succeeded and others can fail. I think a very important one is highlighted by this. You need an external anchor for reforms. And I think in the case of Romania, it was clear that they didn't have that anchor in 99, in the late 90s. It became clear, I think, to the Romanians that they were not going to be put in that first wave of accession that eventually took place in 2004. However, for those countries that were in that accession wave, the reforms really accelerated in the few years before accession. And you can see this, what the chart is showing is the average annual change in the world governance indicators. And we've shaded here, actually the shading is not quite clear, but up to the point of year of accession is the point of the most rapid progress in these indicators. So this is a chart illustrating the importance of external anchors. I'm sure Božidar will, I hope you will say something about this, because it's extremely relevant for Serbia's case at the moment. Okay, now that leads me to the last two chapters, which is about how do you reinforce institutions. And chapter 4 is about human capital. And I'll just show one chart from this analysis. The report analyzes the transition region, the current level of human capital. Again, I'm going to have to go up and show you the points here. So these bars here represent the transition countries, and the invisible bars are the non-transition countries. Now, what we have done is looked at some cross-country databases on educational quality, and looked at the quality of primary education according to a standardized cross-country database, and the quality of secondary education. And if you could see, they're actually very similar. So this one is about here, and this one is about here. So there's not actually, and maybe this is a little surprising to some of you, or maybe not, there's not actually much difference. If you take a broad range of countries, transition and non-transition, there's not actually that much difference in the quality of education, either at primary or at secondary level. Although, of course, there are some significant differences within countries, which I haven't shown here. But when you look at tertiary education, I think there is a big difference. And as proxies for this, we're looking at the number of science and engineering doctorates, which again, in the, if you could see it, in the non-transition region, it's somewhere up here. And another indicator that's worth looking at is the number of patents granted, which is tiny in the transition region. It's up somewhere around here in the non-transition region. So, so the message from this is the importance of tertiary education, because the returns to tertiary education are very strong, but many people actually take those returns abroad, and most countries have had quite significant brain drain during the transition period. So how do you get those people to come back? Well, that's really about the whole message of the report. How do you get convergence and persuade people to come back? At the moment, the level of tertiary education really lags behind in the transition region, and that is holding back the development of human capital. Now, the final chapter is a new departure for us at the EBRD and for the transition report, and this is about this notion of economic inclusion, about extending opportunities to all different groups in the population. Now, what we've done here, this chart, again, it's going to be a little bit difficult to see, so I'll have to talk you through what we're trying to do here. What we've done in this analysis is we've taken our life and transition survey. And from the life and transition survey, we don't really have a good measure of household wealth, but at least we can construct a proxy for that. And that proxy is based on assets. We know by household what assets they have or do not have. Things like car or computer or mobile phone or bank account and the like. Now what we've done is we've tried to explain differences in asset ownership by a few basic characteristics that the individuals themselves cannot influence. So these are whether they were born in an urban or rural area, the level of their father's education, the level of their mother's education, and also whether their parent was a member of the Communist Party. So we're trying to get at this notion of, your birthplace and who you were born into and what connections they had. Things that happened, the things that you had nothing to do with. To what extent is that explaining differences and inequalities in wealth as measured by this asset base? Now, what we see is actually a big variation across countries, but very interestingly, and again, I look to Borja maybe to comment on this later, this inequality of opportunity is particularly high in Southeastern European countries, in countries of the former Yugoslavia especially. It's also true in some of the Eastern European countries like Georgia and Moldova, and also in Tajikistan. So you can see those dots there illustrating the highest point. Can't quite see the breakdown, what's explaining what, but that's not so essential for the point. The main point is that there's a big variation across the region in equality of opportunity. So those countries that have a lot of inequality, then I think there's a big challenge to promote economic inclusion. And one last chart, and again it's invisible, or half of it is. So this chart looks, again using our life and transition survey, one of the questions we ask people is, what is the most important factor to succeed in life in your country now? And one of the options is political connections. Now, in those countries with a lot of inequality, political connections come out very strongly as an answer to this question. It's much lower, the level of inequality is much lower in those who give some other factor as an explanation. Similarly, people are asked, what is the main reason why there are some people in need in our country today? In those countries with high inequality, many people say it's injustice in our society. Whereas it's a much smaller percentage, not visible, sorry, but much smaller percentage of those who say, in the lower inequality countries, who say that. So I think the inequality of opportunity we see in many countries, it really influences the perceptions of people on the ground about what is driving people's good fortune. Is it their own hard work and effort, or is it due to things like political connections? Okay, which brings me to my conclusion, and I guess there are 5 main conclusions here. I want to end. Number 1 is I guess an optimistic note, that I think if you take the broad sweep of time, and after nearly 20 years now writing transition reports, I think we can take a weight of kind of historical perspective and say that, broadly speaking, time is on the side of both democracy and reform. But the second point too is that this process can be slow, and that there are some factors that can then hold it back. And the past 5 years, I think, have been a difficult time for reforms and building economic institutions. So what can countries do? Well, I want to emphasize again the importance of international integration, not just for prosperity, but as a driving force for economic institutions. I think there are important messages also in the report about the need for transparency and accountability at the local levels. I did not have time to focus on the analysis that looks at Russian regions and the differences there, but that's quite interesting for those of you interested in Russia. And there's a need to improve human capital and economic inclusion. So if these things are done, I think they will lead to better economic institutions, but they will also increase the chance of what we call successful critical junctures. So in other words, these critical points when there's a democratic change or a discrete change in the level of democracy, they create opportunities, and some countries have taken them and others have not. And what increases the chances of taking them are these better institutions and things like better human capital and more economic inclusion. And how can we in the international community help? Well, I think we can help in terms of integration, but also education. It's not just our money as the EBRD as an investor, but it's also about dialogue, education, and bringing messages like this to the people. On that note, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm taking over from Slava, who regrettably has to leave. And I suggest that first we will hear all our panelists, and then we will take their questions. Božidar, would you please?
Thank you, Svetlana. Good evening to all. And first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. UCL, where I think last summer I spoke on the Danube strategy. And that was one of my duties when I was the Deputy Prime Minister for some time. And EBRD, of course, which I've been a governor to, and I tried also to run it as one of the candidates to be the president of the EBRD last year. But then some very good British diplomacy and good alliances had it differently. But the race for the first time existed a bit, and I hope it's going to be even more open next time. So, listening to you, I thought maybe I have my points, but actually, probably I'll try to focus a bit more on these critical junctures, because so it happens that in my life I always try to be where things happen. So, when I finished my studies in the States, rather going into consulting investment banking, I actually went with Jeff Sachs and we worked for the Yugoslav government of Ante Markovic. Then the country disintegrated, I moved to work for Leszek Balcerowicz and Janusz Lewandowski in the Polish government for a year and a half, and then moved on east, working for the Gaidar team for 2 years in Russia. And while at McKinsey, I actually happened to have spent a month trying to work and miserably failed in the Romanian Ciorbeia government. And after Milosevic fell, I became finance minister in my country. So I try to be where things happen, and I like those critical junctures because I think, indeed, they can make a lot of difference. You have in corporate world, you have the turnaround specialists, and I try to be in transition a bit of this critical juncturist, I guess, if there's such a term. But first of all, I would like to join Slava, I think, in praising this report. For me, even though, or maybe because it's one of the more academic ones, I think it's also one of the highest quality I've been reading for the past years. It's also, I think, it's because what we read here, actually, the arguments ring true, because I believe that the question posed here, which is where is transition going, why isn't it progressing? And I think if you had the full freedom, you would have taken away even the question mark, because indeed transition is stuck, full point, not question mark. A very important question is what to do about it. And even though the answer, as it always goes, is not fully satisfactory, the great merit of the authors of this report is that they have really tried to provide some answers. So putting their finger where it hurts, and that's typically the politics, the rent-seeking, the corruption, all those problems, and then trying to find an acceptable way for an international financial organization to solve it. So a few years back, yes indeed, Peter and your friends, there seems that this post-communist world discovered a very nice machine, a convergence machine. That was EU accession for the most lucky ones, or at least the EU partnership for the more distant ones, and for those even more distant ones, the US support as the only hegemon superpower at that time, supporting the move away either from the sphere of Russia or, to put it in a more positive way, toward democracy, free markets, and by the way, NATO. That was kind of the game in town, and the first batch with the front runners, Slovenia, Hungary, and others, being joined by the late runners such as Slovakia, entering 2004 actually in pretty good shape. And you know, I love Poland a lot. I'm not going to speak on behalf of Polish people here. I'm sure other Polish people in the audience, a few. There's one on the panel, but they are not traditionally the most positive ones. You know the joke. You give beautiful toys for Christmas to a Polish kid. He starts crying and say, "Why are you crying?" And the kid says, "It's because all those beautiful toys one day will be broken." Okay? and even the Polish people, around 2005 and 6, all my friends that I worked with 10, 15 years before that, had to admit, yes, it had never been better. That has been, and we are living probably, insofar as the Polish state is concerned, the most stable, the most secure, and by many accounts, the better economically looking time of our, not of our lives, but of the history of our country. Ups and downs, those who support PIS party, those who don't support, those who support the civic platform, of course. But broadly, that's where they would agree that the country is. Now, not everybody was as lucky, but by and large, the 2004 crowd, the 8 countries that entered, at that time, really were almost close to claiming victory. Lots of investment we've seen on those charts, even for the blue lines you could not see. It was very impressive. And then in 2007, 2-country crowd entered already in weaker fashion. There was a distinct feeling that Bulgaria and Romania maybe got in for reasons that had not everything to do with the European convergence and had more to do with some ideas of where some rockets would be put. Okay, but nevertheless, people said that's fine, and anyway, growth was still there. All of this was pre-Lehman Brothers. And then Lehman Brothers happened, and of course this crisis, and that's where the central argument of this excellent report is. Convergence is stuck, transition is stuck. Is it because of the crisis, or actually is the crisis only exposing in very stark light the very many political, institutional, economic faults of the transition process in many of the countries? My point of view is it's both. It's really both. It's easy to say that it's the fault of the countries, but it is also the fact that when the partners have problems, it is also more difficult to put a brave face on it and to garner courage to make the necessary changes. So I would say that I think a few years make a big difference. I described Poland, the first batch, the second batch, and today we stand here in London. The whole Commission, European Commission, was to celebrate the Vilnius summit at the end of this week. 4 Eastern Partnership countries were to sign the most wide-ranging association agreement ever offered short of membership at the European Union. They negotiated for the full time of this current setup of the Commission. And here we are, 4 days before the event, and of the 4 countries, Armenia opted out in September, saying that there's another framework they would rather be in. And all of you know, in a relatively spectacular fashion, quite dramatic one, Ukraine, tactically, as they said, did not interrupt, but for the time being suspended the signature of this agreement because they need to have enough gas to go through the winter. They need to sell a few of their wares without their goods and their people being stopped at the Russian border. And in front of that, the EU, as they said, I'm quoting them, had little to offer short of reassurances that the transition and the convergence will take place. But Füle went to Kiev without much cash and almost no credits, including from the EBRD. So that was gone. And by the way, for the 2 remaining ones, Moldova and Georgia, the people in power do not really have the same ideology as the ones that were in power when the negotiations started, for sure. So they will sign, but there will be much less fuel in those association agreements than many people would have expected before. And closer to home, after Croatia, even Eurocrats who are proverbially, prudent. I was for 5 years the deputy prime minister of my country in charge of European integration, and I signed the SAA on behalf of Serbia. Even they say that nobody will join as a full member before the end of this decade at best. So for sure, of the entire 7-year financial perspective, and that's quite important, it's not the same when you join in the middle of a perspective versus joining as Croatia, fortunately for our Croat friends, is joining at the beginning of one, so that you can fully utilize all the instruments and be treated on par over the entire 7-year period as other members. That is something that won't happen. And I will not repeat what Peter said. Even for those who are in, the 2010 Life in Transition survey shows that even there, even though, take Slovenia, and opposing, I don't know, there's people from Slovenia here. They are NATO member and Euro member. And they have been always, and they are still, the most converged ones. The attitudes toward markets, the attitudes toward the European Union have been deteriorating quite significantly. And the sad story is that, in fact, the biggest deterioration of support to market economy and to European values is the strongest in the countries that are most integrated. So as if this elusive goal of Europe, the closer you are under the current crisis situation, the more disappointed you become. So this is where we are, but I guess to complete kind of the bleakness of the beginning of this report that I'm playing you around with my own arguments, how about the Arab Spring countries? Because that's the new frontier of transition. We have had the joyful faces on many of places and saying that the inspiration of the transition countries, of course, much is different, but still what is common is a move from an authoritarian regime to a democratic one. From the joyful demonstrations 3 years ago, we're down to political assassination. Such is the case in Tunisia, or army crackdowns as we have when certain nights, as is in Egypt, we have more than 500 people dead. So that's where we are. And the 2013 transition report starts with this fact-based bleakness, I would say. And then, because it is still part of an IFI and it has a mandate, progressively when you read it, and you should read it, it becomes more and more positive. What is the medicine, Dr. Transition, Dr. Convergence? Well, they say to us, it's a well-known mix of good medicine, but to the benefit of the authors, they do not repeat ad nauseum, as we have heard for 20 years, that you need to open up financially, trade, that you need to make sure that you have good governance, that you should fight corruption, adding new stuff that actually EBRD is new too, but actually the World Bank is around for some time, which is inclusiveness and meritocracy, openness of opportunity. It is also, and I think this is the biggest quality of this report, it is talking not only about what should be done, it is spending a lot of time on wondering why, if it is so demonstrably good, is it not happening, and what can be done for the good reforms to happen. So let me talk to this without repeating the report. The report, again, is identifying what Peter in his introductory section has said. It identifies differences. There is a resource curse. It's more difficult to have a democracy when there is a very big oil or gas or I would say even tourism opportunity, where then the game in town is to take control or be close to the control of those resources. Second thing, of course, is that the closer you are to the center and there is an anchoring, the easier it is. But then again, given the current shape geopolitically, that's not something you can act upon. So I'm glad that here we have this kind of deep power, realpolitik, hard-nosed alliance type of thinking. So let me propose 5 ideas, actually, just for the benefit of our discussion, of what can be done for transition to be more successful again and for convergence to start again. So the first one is to tell an inconvenient truth, as Al Gore would put it. Ladies and gentlemen, convergence is not an internationally guaranteed right. It is an elusive possibility that can happen only when certain... we're running out of time, I know. So I'll try to be brief on my 5 questions, ideas. Yes, indeed, nobody said that the countries will converge. In fact, there was this theory of convergence that was built based on the data. Suddenly people saw that the countries getting closer were converging more and more. Yes, those who were non-communist, Greece, Portugal, and so forth, before converged also. But that was more spectacular even with the former communist countries. You know, the average GDP per capita in our region, without Central Asia, on a PPP basis grew from 30% of the German one to 41% in 2007, and stayed put. Why German and not EU average? Is because the old Yugoslav joke is when you ask a Yugoslav, what would you do if it's the end of the world? He says, I will put my wife and my children in a car and we'll go to Germany. Because that's the sure thing. And the IMF is putting those data on. And since then, it's been 6 years, it's not progressing. So I would say, the answer right now is to say, oh my God, the US is in retreat and the EU is weak. And to many countries, they are looking for another anchor. Turkey, in my country, of late, it has governed very much Abu Dhabi. We do everything with the Arab Emirates. Airplane, agriculture, chips, everything, tourism. Others would say China. Look at the Bucharest summit that just ended. 16 Central European leaders cobbled around China and trying to get a piece of the $20 billion that were earmarked. Okay? No, I think, yes, multipolar world is helping, but the more important one is to do now, the more difficult thing is to say, what do we do without an anchor? There's going to be a world for many, even those joining the EU, the instruments put forward are very weak financially. You would need to exploit your comparative advantage, or like Slovakia did, create one from a country that did not produce one car in their history, becoming the country which is producing the biggest number of cars per person in the world. So that's the first one. Second one, and that's kind of the interplay with the EBRD and its mandate, which is not easy. I guess one should recognize that midterm, there are simply certain countries that will have a divergence between their political progress and their economic progress. And short of saying, you are not a country within our charter, which I think will not happen realistically, it is to do the very many things that can be done to improve the situation. So enlightened authoritarianism, I'm not a very big fan of, but I think that's, for maybe half of the countries of the current remit of the EBRD, is the name of the game. And I think that should be kind of a line of business of its own. The third one is that maybe the hegemons should try to collaborate a bit more than only compete, because I think we're reaching zero-sum games between, as we can see on Ukraine. It's not helping much anyone involved. Not Ukraine for sure, but I'm not sure that Russia or the EU are very much helped by this type of approach. So more inclusive and more collaboration. The fourth, I think, and I hope I will provoke you with this thought before Svetlana stops me fully. Let's try to think outside of the box. Let's try to, if there is an end of convergence, there must be an opportunity coming out of that one. And I'll tell you which one. If indeed convergence will happen at a snail pace, or will not happen at all, it means that the distribution of the value chain, in manufacturing in particular, can be distributed in a stable manner across the transition countries. So rather than running to emerging Asia, with IP issues and all the problems where, for example, today, many Chinese regions have become less attractive than many transition corners, this Europe plus transition will be the place where those distributions of value chains can be internalized and everybody will feel much more comfortable than in many other situations. So I think that's one opportunity of lack of convergence. And then finally, I think the EBRD, now I'm talking about the EBRD, I think should focus more on the element of its remit, which actually can work best in a less converging world. Let me give you one example, and I'll stop there. Before, in the financial institutions, the big thing for the EBRD was to promote the entrance and the development of euro-based banks in transition countries. And that worked nicely until Basel III. Now it's over. I'm almost done. Now it's over, so I think what we need to do is to do much more of the domestic capital markets, making sure that the new players, such as the wealth funds, find through the EBRD a channel to be put in place. So I would say, in a non-convergent world, there is ample scope for the mandate of the EBRD. So with this,
I'm really sorry for interrupting you. Yeah,
I'm done.
but we're supposed to have a discussion
I'm done.
also.
I'm done.
Thank you very much
Thank you. Thank you.
Also, great. And our next discussant and panelist, Julia, please.
Question one is whether the transition is really the route to accession. So that's the only possibility. Transition to the market economy through reforms. That is what should be advised for the so-called emerging countries. Let's start with openness. It's a very important question, and even economic reforms and economic institutions are measured through openness. What was the main lesson of the crisis? The lesson from the crisis for most of the countries was that openness, financial globalization, makes you vulnerable. There is deleveraging. We read it in the transition report. The cross-border deleveraging. There's fluctuating FX rates. So it means that if you are in the middle of the financial globalization, you increase your vulnerability. It means capital control is very good. There is very few words about monetary policy framework. The report mentioned monetary policy measures as if the monetary policy framework was similar in all the countries. It's not true at all. These countries are quite different concerning monetary policy frameworks. Only 1/3 of them is inflation targeting. Those kind of countries who select independent monetary policy with flexible exchange rate. We know the crucial trilemma. You cannot be independent, you cannot follow independent monetary policy, manage FX rate, and do not capital control, that is, liberalize your capital account. I think most of the countries would like to control their FX and neither give up independent monetary policy as the currency board countries. There are very few currency board countries, and they chose this framework much before the crisis. So what we see now during the crisis, that most of the countries try some kind of capital control, keep controlling FX, and keep the independence of monetary policy. The other famous trilemma, the so-called Rodrik trilemma, you know, that what do you choose? Nation state, mass politics, or international economic integration? You cannot choose the three at the same time. And what we see now, that most of the countries want to keep the nation state, want to keep the mass politics, and rather give up international integration. So what I see and what I read from the report is that there is no hope to foster international integration, as was on the last slide. I think it's still there. Yeah, point 3, foster international integration. Because most of the countries see that it's not the way where I would like to go if I want to be in accession. And here is my major problem with the report. There is no clear proof that economic reforms will help you with a faster growth. The slide which was shown by Peter is from one box in the chapter 1, which is a quite dubious econometric exercise, and by the way, there is no variable which is closely related with structural economic reforms. They're much more related to openness. And you can say that, okay, from the box it turns out that openness is somehow related to faster growth, but the proof, unfortunately, not strong enough, and it's nothing to do with economic reforms. So my very sad conclusion is that from the report, I do not see that those countries who would like to be successful and would like to be in the way of accession should open their frontiers and they should run economic reforms. My favorite case study is Belarus, of course. I am not very happy with the final result. But I'm afraid that not only Hungary, which is in the way toward Belarus, the actual Belarus state, but a lot of other countries, because it's much easier now not to follow structural reforms. Are you sure that these countries are not now in accession? What was the forecast for the EU? The EU, which is actually, if you see the recent papers of Larry Summers, in a permanent stagnation, yeah? So if the EU is in stagnation going down, I am in accession, even with my slowed down growth rate. And maybe I will be Belarusia, where the inequality decreases, where people accept the lack of political freedom, where the GDP growth rate is higher than in some open and well-reformed countries. So, reading the report, I'm very much upset, because if I read it with the eyes of my own government, they get a lot of good reason why to follow the way they have chosen. And the way where Hungary is much more the way where Belarus arrived. It's not yet clear from the report, because of course you can transform institutions away that still Hungary, okay, downgraded in some respect, but still at the top concerning both political and economic institutional environment. By the way, there is a big contradiction concerning Hungary. It's downgraded because our government made a so-called strategic alliance with some multinationals, and it's downgraded because it's not a level playing field. And what I read then among the advice proposed to Hungary, one of the key priorities, that they should follow the strategic partnership agreement with a number of multinationals because it makes the environment more computable. So downgraded and advised do so. By the way, they do it, and it's really not a level playing field. What I miss concerning Hungary is all these aspects which are summarized in a brilliant paper of János Kornai, which was published in the Economics on Transition, in October 2012, which is about the centralization within Hungary and its possible consequences. I think it would be nice to reread it and somehow to include in the next report, because that reflects really where we are on the road toward the Belarus end. And I hope that it's not the choice, not the final choice of all these countries. And I would believe that Bodhisattva is right, and rather these countries will choose political freedom and economic reforms. But actually I do not know why they should.
Thank you very much, Julia.
Okay. I mean,
Tomasz.
yes, we have 10 minutes. So I'll try to spend 5 minutes, and then we have 5 minutes for discussion.
We have even 6 or 7 minutes for discussion.
May I ask a question, actually? How many people in this room read Acemoglu and Robinson? Because
Oh yeah,
depending on the answer, I may talk about something or I may talk about something else.
that I wanted to mention.
May I ask you this question? Who read Acemoglu and Robinson book? All right. Okay. So
If they are right.
Acemoglu and Robinson is the book is about inclusive economic institutions and inclusive political institutions. And the whole idea in the book is that there is correspondence between those two. So where you have inclusive economic institutions, you tend to develop inclusive political institutions. Where you have inclusive political institutions, you tend to develop open markets. Now, there is one implication of that for the title of this report, because I wouldn't say what we face is that some of those countries are stuck in transition. What we face is basically that they are on different trajectories. Because if you take Acemoglu and Robinson seriously, then what you should see is a different type of convergence, and this is a convergence between political regimes and economic regimes. And from that point of view, actually you can ask very different questions, and then you will see that some of those answers are far more consistent, because basically what you see is that some of those countries evolved towards more consistency between the two. That's my first comment. The second comment is that the real question is what we mean by inclusive political institutions. Acemoglu and Johnson is not really very clear on this, and if you have a good example of how many ambiguities we have there, is Egypt. Well, Egypt had a government which was elected by what seems to be decent popular votes, yet it clearly wasn't a government which had anything to do with with political pluralism. So the real challenge is to discuss what is there in the political conditions that makes those institutions inclusive. Because it is not about elections, because what we see around the world, not only in transition countries, is a lot of countries where you have elections, and basically then the winners take all, and there is no political consensus, and this is basically not the beginning of the story, but the end of the story. Well, that's a kind of pessimistic conclusion, because the conclusion is here that inclusive political institutions are far more difficult to build than anybody can assume. But there is another optimistic story which is kind of overlooked by Acemoglu and Robinson. This is a story of change from below. Now, and this is one of the problems you have with the transition indicators, because they assume that everything is happening at the country level. And it's not quite what we see. We did mention Ukraine. We did see Ukraine where the change happened from below. We see it recently in Kiev again. We don't know how that will finish, but some of those processes are far more difficult than just critical junctions where suddenly, unexpectedly, some dictatorship collapses and then basically we have change. It's far more difficult to predict or analyze where this change from below is coming from, but it is there and it is possible. And there are conditions which make it more likely. One of those conditions, for example, is to have open media and open discussion, open internet, and so on. This kind of change became far more likely in present world simply because the communication technology is so much better. And we see much of that happening already in many countries. Now, I thought I have about two more points. One is that there was hardly anything I could disagree with what I heard today, but then Julia gave me an opportunity to disagree, which is basically about the impact of reforms of economic growth. I can come back to that in open discussion, but the link is there. I spent some time running those regressions myself. Peter did some of the best crafted papers on growth and transition. The link is there. I don't want to discuss this point anymore, but I can come back to that, and we can talk about econometrics. Now, the problem is somewhere else. The problem is really that for this region, what matters is not in the region. What matters is in the EU. You see that not only in Central Eastern Europe, you see that in many other parts of the world. The reforms in China did start because they were successful countries around China. Before China, you had South Korea, you had Taiwan, you had Singapore, you had Hong Kong, and so on and so on. And the same story basically happened in Central Eastern Europe. The only problem was that Chinese who had Hong Kong on the other side of the straits at one stage decided that the better way than building a wall which would stop people risking their life to swim to Hong Kong was basically to try to do something on the mainland. The Soviet bloc didn't make this choice in the late 70s. They built more walls, and basically, therefore, things got as bad that the whole system collapsed. So we had different trajectory. But the point of reference for Central Eastern Europe will and remain Western Europe, because this is the group of rich countries. And what is quite unfortunate is basically that the euro area is still in crisis, and nobody knows how this crisis will finish. And that is one of the major factors which makes Europe less attractive, and this is what is behind some of those surveys. If Eurozone will not be sorted out soon, then some of those reforms will remain unpopular because simply the people learn by experience. Now, when I was saying about the country level, some of the recent work we are doing on Bosnia is showing just that. Bosnia is a country where institutions are sort of dysfunctional. Now, the point is that still you have the whole variety in Bosnia between places where those institutions are far better and some of those where those institutions are really not good. You may say actually the same thing about Russia and quite a few of those countries. Some of the mistake of this kind of looking from above is basically that you can learn a lot by learning from some of the local conditions where the things work and trying to implement the same solutions in another part of the same country. And that is typically far more easier than trying to import what works from another country and then implement it where you want to implement it. So-called institutional transplants. They're always difficult. And finally, what I really like about this report is that there is something about labor markets. The labor markets were never in the transition indicators because that was politically difficult. I have some of my best colleagues are working for the Trade Union Institute in Brussels, and I can tell you that as soon as there will be some labor market indicators in the report, they would raise hell, because basically they wouldn't like it. Still, we know from some of the econometric work that the labor market flexibility actually matters. And the second omission is, Julie actually touched upon that, is basically that there's still nothing there on the institutional frameworks that result in sound macroeconomic policies. I was not going to talk about Poland, but I will give that as an example. Poland has what is called the fiscal constitution. There is a limit of how much you can spend. Now, for the last few years, our old friend from UCL, Rostowski, was tinkering with Polish finance, trying to get around this and basically nationalize private pensions to make some short-term gains, learning from our Hungarian friends. But basically, still, having this in the constitution made the whole thing far more difficult. Full stop. So somehow it still creates, maybe not a perfect constraint, but it creates some constraint. And again, the questions around fiscal constitution, the questions around credible monetary policy underpinned by genuine central bank independence, those are critical questions, because a lot of what is going on in the current crisis is effectively about bad macroeconomic policies. And that macroeconomic policies, like running huge budget deficit, are often still going back to some of the institutions, and those institutions are not really still captured by the EBRD report. Having that, I enjoyed it immensely.
Thank you. It works, but I'm not sure. Thank you very much, Tomek, and thank you very much for all of you. I just, we're supposed to finish exactly this time, even discussion, but I think that we have to have discussion. And but I just wondering, our panelists gave so thought-provoking comments, even criticizing by themselves. So maybe, Julie, you would like to answer Tomek critique first, and or we can open discussions, and then we'll okay.
To make it clear, I think it's impossible now to decide, because these are really econometric exercises. The big question where I think we again should start somewhere from the beginning, which was somehow a given statement for us that market economy is better than the non-market economy. And unfortunately, after the crisis, it's again not so straightforward as it was earlier. So that's why I say that the word transition toward the market economy should be much better explained, should be much more empirical evidence to be collected, to say that, yeah, if you converge toward the European market economies, it's a big step for you on the long-term growth path. But because of the crisis of the EU, unfortunately, it's not so straightforward as it was before. So in that sense, I think we fully agree.
Thank you very much. And now, please, questions for, yeah? Any questions? Comments?
I have
Yes,
one.
please.
Hello, I'm from UCL. I'm doing PhD there. I would like to ask you how the reforms which tackle corruption and for like our aim at for reducing corruption in those countries, how do they fit into the picture, and how they affect the results you have shown us?
A few questions?
Maybe a few questions to Peter, and then, yeah? More questions too? More questions? Oh.
I can have more.
Okay, go ahead.
No, well, that's that different point. Even though we have this kind of transition, now we have very recent example of Ukraine, which future was decided based on political will. Will we send Tymoshenko to Germany or not? And this is not, I don't think that you can actually capture it within the econometrics. So what is the solution for it in my opinion? Thank you.
I think on the Tymoshenko thing, I'm hoping somebody else will help me with that. But on corruption, it is implicitly and in some cases explicitly in the report when we look at economic institutions and the World Bank governance indicators, some of which are connected with exactly the issue of corruption, either directly or indirectly. So it comes into the analysis in that sense. I mean, it is an issue that we do track at the EBRD through our surveys, like the Life and Transition survey. So there are questions in that which are about corruption, basically corruption in public services. We ask people to what extent do people have to pay bribes to get services and so on. So we have different measures by countries, and we have measures of corruption from our business environment survey. So there's a big business environment survey we do jointly with the World Bank every few years. And again, one can do analysis cross-country of the different degrees of corruption and then correlate it with other variables. And you know, in the past we have done analysis of the impact of corruption on economic performance, and not surprisingly, countries that are less corrupt, other things being equal, tend to perform better than those that are more corrupt. But of course, one can slice the econometric work in many different ways, and so on. So it's analytically, I think it is important to try to measure corruption, and these surveys allow us to see how it evolves over time. As an institution, of course, we have a very strong policies on tackling corruption through our projects and our due diligence and our background checks on the clients we work with. We are trying also to develop a new initiative on, we call it broadly, investment climate and good corporate governance, which we intend to roll out in selected countries, where we will try and work with the authorities in selected countries where there is buy-in for really tackling corruption, and using our very project-focused and our private sector-focused approach to see are there specific institutions we can help to put in place that will make a lasting difference on corruption.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, can I ask something general on corruption? I did some work on Kazakhstan. Basically what you see in Kazakhstan is that corruption is widespread, but nobody pays much, effectively. They have sort of standard payments. It's not really a problem from the business point of view, relatively speaking. What is far more important than corruption is what is hidden under Polity 4 in some of your regressions in the report, which is the core part of that indicator is what is called effective constraints on the executive branch of the government. Very long title. Effective constraints on the executive branch of the government. If you take our Acemoglu and Johnson paper, they take it as the main key measure of the security of property rights, which it is. So what is harmful for business is not kind of petty corruption where you have to pay some standard bribe to a custom officer. As long as you are not in Sierra Leone and they don't stop your truck, 20 times on the road to the ferry, for example, you are okay. The problem is when you have a government which is kind of predatory and effectively will hit you whenever they wish to. So the far more fundamental feature than corruption is basically security of property rights. And this is what links with some of those core. And this is, by the way, why the story is not as simple as in Acemoglu and Johnson, because the story is not necessarily about parallel institutions which are economics and parallel institutions which are politics. It's basically the fact that on the top level, those two coincide. They are very difficult to distinguish.
Thank you, Tomasz. More questions or comments?
I'm Oliver Geit, an analyst at Aegis Advisory for Central and Eastern Europe. We've heard some very interesting views from the panel on transition in general. I was just wondering, in my research, quite a lot of what I see is especially within Central Europe and within the former Yugoslavia and the Western Balkans, I see a lot more regionalism. I see the Visegrad Four having ever more meetings with even occasionally Merkel and Sarkozy coming along. I see that certainly a lot of our clients, they view their local subsidiaries in places like Poland and Slovakia as hubs for the region. I look at the former Yugoslavia and a lot of some of the larger companies in the region. I'm thinking specifically of, for example, Mercator. They look very much towards the region for growth rather than, as far as I can see, looking towards perhaps Western Europe. Would the panel agree with that? And do they think that, would you say that perhaps transition, that this might be one way for the economies to sort of look forward in future?
Let me try for Western Balkans. I think transition is another layer of history. It did not start from an emptiness. And I think in the report, what I found very interesting is that, mind you, in EBRD, you see that there are differences in performance depending whether you were under the Russian, the Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, or other empire. So that's kind of the. So my answer to your question is, there is a historical legacy. So of course, ex-Yugoslavs, there are brands that with the breakup of Yugoslavia became boxed into one of the countries coming out of Yugoslavia, and then later on they got re-expanded where they were before. So you mentioned one group, but there are several over there. And so yeah, and I cannot talk to Comecon, ex-Comecon countries, but probably it's the same thing in terms of division of labor that existed in the times of the Comecon. I'll take the opportunity to answer one question that you asked about why it seemed that in ex-Yugoslavia there is more inequality than in other places. Basically, that some people have a head start in life. Interestingly, Peter, it's not about those who have more money. It was social capital. If you look what you put in your analysis, it was not who had more money to start with, it was whose father or mother had a higher education and so forth. And I think that comes also from history. There are certain corners of transition where transition was not at the same time, I guess, as was in Poland, a way to run away from an empire when you wanted to be and to be again part of Europe. In ex-Yugoslavia, a lot of the elites stayed. Slovenia is one example. And in fact, you had much more continuity in the personnel, and therefore their children also got more of a benefit of those stable elites, which in some way is a positive, but of course in many ways it's also a drawback.
Yes, I want to follow up on the comment Božidar made on the role of China, increasing role of China in the region. And I haven't read the report yet. I didn't have a chance, but I suspect that there is not much talk about China in the current report.
Not very much.
No, not very much. But Peter, perhaps would you be able to comment on the potential effects of the likely increasing role of China in the region and potential effect of its involvement and its role on the incentive to reform, for example? I mean, which at the moment, one can speculate about the potential effects, but still.
Yeah. It is something we are looking at a bit more, not in the report, but internally at the EBRD, the impact of China on our countries of operations. I mean, it's not seriously on the table that China would become a country of operations, but certainly Chinese investment to the region is increasing, and there are examples in the countries represented here on the panel, increasing numbers of examples, and we're trying to understand a bit better, what kind of sectors they're going into, what the Chinese want, basically, what their interests are, and what might be the advantages of us possibly working with Chinese investors in
are they demanding the same
cases,
preconditions as the Western European companies which expand? And Božidar basically supports my suspicion that they don't. Yeah.
They don't. No.
Well, they ask for a sovereign guarantee.
Yeah.
For the time being, almost nothing done without sovereign guarantee. But basically, it's my experience. I mean, currently in Serbia there are 3 projects. One is on a highway, one is a bridge on the Danube, and the third one just signed is for a thermal plant in Bucharest. Orban and the Serbian Prime Minister got together, you know, and coupled with the Chinese, they said we're gonna do the high-speed rail between Belgrade and Budapest at 200 kilometers an hour, which is of course has no economic interest
So as a
whatsoever.
matter of fact, there are dreams.
So
about-
basically, you get the money. It's typically 10 to 20 years. It's 3% in dollars, and you get free grace period. And about 50% of the work have to be done by Chinese companies. Once you sign, negotiation starts. And at each start of the contract, you have to renegotiate.
So if we contrast it to the experience of the Western Europe and
They are definitely more gung-ho. They have earmarked companies with which you are going to work, so you don't have the hassle of going through the tender of EIB, EBRD. But there are a host of issues and problems that then appear during the execution, and there's an emerging body of experience that policymakers in the region talk about. So China will have an impact, but it's not a silver bullet, of course. Nothing is silver bullet.
I think that in some countries in Central and Eastern Europe, there are much more hope to cooperate with China than hope in China to cooperate with Eastern Europe. In the Hungarian inflation report, which is the official report of the Hungarian Central Bank, they devoted already a special box to the Far Eastern cooperation. There's a new department is set up, and they made a big conclusion that so far we had in our foreign trade around 80% share to the region and to Germany. And now the Far East is going forward, and from 1 basis point, its share now already increased to 1.1 basis point. And if we follow with that speed, then soon China will be our main trade partner. But I think if you compute this 1 basis point, that how long it will last, it's not tomorrow.
but your argument about disincentive to reform, do you think the Chinese involvement would serve as a disincentive to reform, or to reform as?
It's not that strong yet. So I think in 20-year time you can ask this question.
You wouldn't speak, I mean,
Actually,
you would argue that would...
it's a good
be-
argument that why we shouldn't go to the transition to the market economy, because you see that China is a successful country. So it's an argument, it emerges, but it's not from the Chinese part, it's from the part of some governments.
But so far, to my knowledge, there was not one policy prescription coming out of China. It is project-based. It's fully project-based. So you do it, you just negotiate. They're not telling you that's the Chinese way.
Absolutely.
Don't do it the European. Not at all. Not at all.
George Bojev. I work for Nomura in investment banking covering the CE region. I have a question more in the political sense rather than the financial. I'm a Bulgarian national. We're currently not very popular in the Daily Telegraph the recent days. Yeah. I'm interested how you change an inherently corrupt government when you don't have an adequate substitute, people-wise. And it's more like a generation, it's not just a few people that you need to change. And then one more question, how do you alter people's mindset that I do believe that is the foundation for a successful convergence and integration to the EU or whatever institution?
Shall I try? Okay, I mean, there are a few things you can do.
One more thing. Thank you for a very transparent and very honest lecture, because not all people target the problems with their whatever they are.
Yeah, there are two things that may help. One is technology, the other one is replacing human capital. The Georgian solution, you know, the Georgian solution, they had endemic corruption with their police on the roads. Whenever you drove a car in Tbilisi, you could be stopped, bribe would be extracted, and so on. What they basically did, that for some time they didn't have road police, full stop. They just fired everybody, and then they started from scratch. Apparently it worked. I wasn't there, the story may be counterfactual, but this is the way I heard it. The other thing is actually an Indian story, but it's a well-documented story of IT. One of the poorest regions of India, Andhra Pradesh, where they introduced technology. The challenge they faced was not to scare the officials, so they're quite clever because they didn't change the law, they didn't change any employment in bureaucracy, they just introduced, they streamlined the procedures. So you could, instead of, say, having 20 different operations and 20 different offices to contact, you had everything in one place and you could use your computer. So they transformed the existing law into a computer algorithm. It worked. The less, again, it's the same story. The less arbitrary power you have, the less scope for corruption. This is, by the way, one of the mistakes, one of the problems I was mentioning institutional transplants. One of the problems that people here are making, mistakes people here are making, and even more in Brussels, is to assume that any kind of regulation will be implemented by the same quality of bureaucracy that you find in Britain or France. Okay? So a lot of what is going on is people envisage very complicated regulatory regimes, and then banking is a classic example, the Basel agreements and all this. It just takes it as a template, the quality of US regulators, British regulators, or French regulators. Now, you take this thing and you try to implement the same thing in, I don't want to pick in a country, but say, let's say Costa Rica, just for the sake of an argument, and all you have is corruption, right? Because you are simply, you have a complex regulatory device and you are giving it to bureaucrats, increasing the space of arbitrary decisions. If the quality of your bureaucracy is low, the only thing you can do is basically to shrink it, not to expand. And this is one of the problems those countries are facing because of the EU. Because the EU template was based on France, where there's a long-standing culture of bureaucracy. Of course, there's a corruption, but there's a well-functioning bureaucracy. You take the same model, you apply this in Poland, or Bulgaria, or somewhere else, now Moldova, you face problems.
Well, nowadays there is even more incentive to be corrupt because of the money flow from the European Union for reconstruction. So,
well, that's the Greece scenario, where basically you get a lot of money, and then instead of helping you, it makes things worse. Or say Sicilian scenario. If you follow the history of Sicily, Palermo and all this, and you trace the history of the Sicilian mafia, you can see what kind of impact construction industry and some of this money had on flourishing of Sicilian mafia. So we had this scenario. Of course, you can have an Irish scenario, which was optimistic, the same kind of money, and it worked. Again, the absorbing capacity was different. The bureaucratic culture was different. But again, if the bureaucratic culture is low, you think twice before you give them money to spend.
I'm Scottish. What advice was the panel give the Scottish government to achieve a referendum? And what the relationship would be within Europe?
Well, Europe is disintegrating in terms of national borders. Let's face it. The number of countries in Europe is growing because Europe is a sign of success. Nobody's afraid of their neighbors, so the number of countries is growing. Over the last 25 years, the number of countries in Europe is much more than it was 25 years ago. It probably will grow. I hope, from my personal point of view, I hope Scotland will remain part of the United Kingdom, but if it will not, I think United Kingdom will survive.
See, initially Europe was a marketing organization. It's now becoming political.
Europe is coming, in terms of number of countries, Europe is coming where it was at the beginning of 19th century already. And the reason for that is basically it's a more secure place.
More questions, comments? More comments from the panel?
Read the report.
Online.
EBRD.com.
I'm Daniel at UCL, I do research on the
my focus also in the research, and I'll be interested in what your opinion is mainly the most advanced Central Eastern European states, the ones that says joined the EU in 2004, that had the spectacular growth to the years preceding the crisis. But then, as the crisis started, had very different policy reactions to it, and some, especially the distinction can be drawn between the Baltics and the Visegrad. And what do you think is the driving factor behind these differences in the policy?
Well, that's quite a broad question. I mean, let's keep in mind the different economic outcomes. So in the Baltics, you have extremely deep recessions, and minus 15%, I think, and that kind of order in 2009. Also, these are very small countries, fixed exchange rates, and so on. They didn't have much choice other than to really, have some kind of internal devaluation, and they have been praised for that, and they are growing strongly. But I personally, I think some of that praise is a little bit overdone, because the depth of the recession was such that they were bound to grow strongly once they started to recover. I mean, but you have very different experiences in the Visegrad countries. Like Poland did not have a recession. Hungary, we know. I mean, Julia can talk at length, I'm sure, about the policy reactions there. Slovenia, I just want to say something about Slovenia, because this link between reform and growth. I mean, for a long time, Slovenia was held up as an example of a country that, in many ways, hadn't really done fundamental reform, and yet it was the richest country in the region, and so on. And we had been warning, and our people on the ground had been warning that Slovenia was a bit of an accident waiting to happen, that at some stage there would be serious economic problems there because of this cozy relationship between state-owned companies and banks, which were and still are state-owned, the biggest ones, and it is coming home to roost now, I think, in Slovenia. So I think we get many things wrong at EBRD, but in Slovenia we were right some years ago that there would be problems down the road.
Yeah, I mean, for several years now, I tend to update for my students a graph where I have economic growth in Slovenia and economic growth in Estonia. As it happens, I know two countries because I have friends in both. Now, the trade-off is this, and again, the trade-off is that in Estonia, you have a wild variation in economic growth. In Slovenia, it's far more flat, but the difference in average growth is actually increasing for Estonia almost continuously. So the uneasy choice is between openness, more variation in growth rate, and the rate of growth. That was written a long time ago about Thailand versus India. That story was written in Asia. Thailand, much more variation in growth, faster growth. India, more stable, and so on. Now, this is that's a kind of policy choice. Estonia had to do it because they were far more difficult conditions initially. Slovenia had the trend of being located very close to the geographical and economic center of Europe. They are nicely located. It was a richer country at the beginning. They didn't feel that much pressure. But the difference is there, and again you can say the same story about Latvia. But those things are easy in small countries because it's easier. You have to have a lot of social consensus to, and then again Ireland is a similar case. You have to have a lot of social consensus to went through such a cycle. In a country like Poland, it's just too big for that. I could not imagine to have this kind of consensus that would be necessary to have kind of Estonian scenario. To be able to be so flexible. So I'm afraid it has something to do again with the size of the country. Even if I would like United Kingdom to stay together, but small countries.
But Slovenia is not that much bigger than Estonia.
No, it's the same. It's the same. It just they were not pressed. It's about those critical junctions that Asimov and Robinson talk about. Some paradoxical thing is that when you have really good crisis, there's a chance to go on a very different trajectory. Slovenia never had a really decent crisis.
No.
Yet.
Welcome to Chelsea. This one is purely political, but to Mr. Delic, if I understood you well, saying that we need to acknowledge differences in economic performances and political performances, which you followed by the sentence, so enlightened dictatorship, kind of. If you could just elaborate on that part, especially regarding Serbia.
Well, how can I say? I mean, Serbia came out of an authoritarian regime for sure. I'm in opposition to the current government, so I have critiques, but I'm not going to say it's authoritarian. And by all means, you can see that Serbia now is a democracy. There has been 12 elections for the last 13 years, and they were fair. No, I had a different country in mind, different countries in mind, in particular those that have resources, and maybe those who are not so close to the European perspective. And you can hear a lot of problems within the EBRD, because this is an EBRD report, it shouldn't be EBRD centered, wondering whether one should work with the countries which have not fully embraced democracy. And the question can be asked now with the Arab Spring countries as well. I don't think it's a question for, and I mean, to the risk of shocking with my colleague from Hungary, I know the troubles they have also, but I don't know if we should say that the Hungarian regime right now is authoritarian or not. We can discuss that, okay? It's more this question. What do you do when you have countries that have the benefit or the curse of abundant resources, or that through history have never experienced democracy and do not seem to move in that direction currently or in the next 5 to 10 years. I'm not talking about 23 years. Do we engage? Don't we engage? My point of view is definitely to engage. To engage because engagement is good, and that's why I think also, no matter how people are disappointed with what has happened around Ukraine, I think we will see further twists and turns. There will be, and it's much better to stay engaged rather than to say, until you reach a certain level of performance politically, we will not engage you economically. Full point. It's a dynamic, and I think the more you do in economic, it's going to influence at the end of the day the politics. Maybe not as fast as you would hope, but an enlightened ruler, even it's he, it's never she, I would say. he would, well, maybe one or two exceptions. They will see a point in also having advancement, because they don't want to end up like some of the people of the last 5 to 10 years.
Thank you. We have to finish, so I can take just one last question or comment. No?
I can again volunteer.
Maybe just for a change.
I'm Parvan from UCL. As you mentioned that, Mr. Delic, you mentioned that the countries are looking for new anchors, and you talked about Abu Dhabi, and there was the talk about China, and you mentioned Turkey as well. Can you talk a bit more about that? Why would countries turn to Turkey?
Turkey has been open in having a more autonomous foreign policy. Partly, and I'm going to quote Mr. Erdogan, Mr. Davutoglu, Mr. Gül, not to speak on their behalf, but that's what they say. They see they've been a candidate negotiating forever to join the EU, and there's a lot of resistance to open one more chapter, and a lot of there's, to put it diplomatically, not consensus that Turkey should be a full-fledged member soon. We did put it diplomatically, okay? And Mr. Sarkozy and Mrs. Merkel have been more open about it. So then Turkey said, then our goal would be, because we are a large, successful country, we are going to have our own policy of zero problem with the neighbors, and definitely without going to recreate this Ottoman Empire, we will want to have working relations even outside of this EU framework with countries that want to work with us. And in that sense, you could see Turkish companies more present, bidding more. They have sure did not allocate enough resources. I can tell you one thing. I had a meeting with Mr. Erdogan, with the rest of the team, and they wanted to do a piece of the highway linking, going from Belgrade down to Montenegro through the Sanjak region, which is important for, Turkish history. And contrary to what China or Azerbaijan did a bit 1 year later, the Turks did not want to give the 18 million euro of grant that would make it OECD compatible, so that we could do a bilateral deal without infringing any general rule. I hope I'm not too technical, but basically they need to put some cash to do their foreign policy, and in that specific case they did not. So we ended up doing it with China and Azerbaijan, our new friend.
Thank you.
And ours as well.
And
Yeah.
Hungarian.
Thank you very much for that. Let me just conclude briefly that for me, personally, it was quite challenging and interesting. And what I learned from today's presentation and from transition reports, that it is a lot of uncertainties around. In transition report, it is said that political opportunities may gradually lead to better economic institutions, but there is still, and economic growth can be focused or guaranteed to some extent in the short run, but we can't say anything specific or precise in the long run. So what are remedies for better growth? And it emerges from today's discussion that it is a lot of different scenarios. So what might be interesting for me personally, in maybe to be introduced in future transition reports, that some kind of different scenarios for development, for choosing the way, whether to access it or not. So, because I believe that the degree of uncertainties which we assess somehow individually may affect people's decisions and political decisions as well, not only economical decisions, so which way to choose. If we have some, just imagination of uncertainty, this is one point, but if we could quantify it somehow, it might help, or at least just give some ideas of possible more likely or favorable ways of development. So thank you very much for, I would like to thank our panelists first, and you for coming, and I hope that it was a Pareto improvement today for you to learn from EBRD, and for EBRD and panelists learn from your questions. Today was our second event of this joint EBRD in conjunction with the European Institution of UCL, presentation of transition report, and I very much hope that we establish now a good tradition, and next year we will meet, maybe here or for the next, to discuss the next report. Peter, thank you very much for giving this in live. And now we have to finish, and I invite all of you to enjoy a glass of wine and continue informal discussion. Thank you very much.